followed by a Q&A from the audience, and then ending with a feedback and discussion section from Carl. Thank you very much for starting the recording, Carl. Yeah, today I'm delighted to introduce Shagor Rahman. He's a senior product manager and researcher exploring the role of active inference in symbolic systems with a focus on data-driven product innovation. And without further ado, I'll pass it on to you, Shagor. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Great, thank you, and thanks for having us. Thanks, Carl. Thanks, Christoph, for taking the time. It's super. We appreciate it so much. I'll do it without audio. Yeah, I know you guys are both busy, so am I sharing my screen now?
Mm-hmm.
Probably, yeah. Cool. And I'll scroll to the top. But can you guys see the slides?
Not yet. I think you might have just turned off video. Or at least I can't see it at the moment.
No, I can't either, I think.
I think under, like, at the top right, there should be a share button somewhere. Yes. I think we
Doing something.
Yeah. I think, yeah, now we can see it. Yeah, perfect.
Awesome. Can you guys see it now?
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, cool. All right, so I'll jump into it. So yeah, I thought that so I did one of these before, Christoph, and my thought was that this one would be a bit quicker. I still think it will be, but I ended up with a number of slides, so I'll jump into it. So I guess, yeah, for quick context, that one was I had contacted Carl and a few of his colleagues, I'm sure a few of your colleagues, about an idea that I had, which was kind of the myth of objectivity and hypothesis, which essentially ties together the origins of symbolic cognition and our development of cultural identification and morality. And after that paper, I thought, well, there's certainly applications in the social sphere. So spent some time talking about this. So this is kind of the prequel to that talk. So what, essentially kind of this gets into my goals for today, which is that I mainly want to, obviously go over some of the formalizations that I have behind the theory, and I'll kind of explain what the theory is as kind of a reminder for Carl and an introduction for you, Christoph, and whoever joins, and explain not only kind of why I framed it the way I did here, but the motivation for it and kind of how that connects to the myth. So specifically, one more time, the formalizations will start without necessarily a direct tie to the theory, which is the connection between morality and cultural identification, but it'll try to map to some dichotomies and paradigms within symbolic processing and cognitive science and semiotics and some other things. And hopefully that kind of framework, the kind of manipulation I do, the motivation for that is kind of clear in how it syncs with the myth of objectivity. So yeah, so beyond that kind of main intuition, hopefully I can adequately explain the equations, maybe get some kind of feedback on how to refine them or kind of start from scratch, or how maybe they map to things that are kind of already done in the literature. It was a quick kind of simulation I did, so I'll kind of review that really quickly. And then the kind of next, the kind of final step in what I was trying to get after was, how do I kind of gain traction for this? I think it does introduce an interesting perspective on human society and kind of our cultural niche. It tells kind of a different story than some other ones. So some similar ones are kind of Joseph Henrique's origins of or the secret to human success and things like that, where he talks about cultural evolution and a lot of important things. I think this kind of adds a different narrative onto that. There's some other ones as well. And then the last bit here was, is there a chance that some of this could be operable? One of the areas I'm product managing at the moment is a project with the Active Inference Institute that Daniel Freeman put me in touch with, but we're essentially building a knowledge graph based on topic modeling. So yeah, I was curious if some of this might be kind of operable down the road, in terms of kind of building a knowledge graph, and kind of get into more details on how that could be applicable, and hopefully that'll be clear. So cool, yeah, and feel free to stop me with questions. Yeah, so kind of quick overview. I'm missing a couple pieces here, but the components of the fraternity principle and active inference, I'm sure I don't have to go into too much detail, but just kind of highlighting the parts that I think are kind of relevant to what I end up doing with the formalization. Secondly, the problem with symbols. So what kind of questions does symbols raise, given that we are all predictive modeling machines? What are our symbols, and how do they represent something kind of categorically unique? Do they represent something categorically unique? So I'm going to go over that a bit. I'll explain kind of how the myth of objectivity hypothesis in my framework answers some of those questions, proposes and answers some of those questions, and don't have it here, but I'll go over a bit of the simulation. And the main slide, I think, is a quick kind of made up narrative for how this all came about. It's a super quick slide, but it kind of explains how the different pieces that I'll go over could have potentially answered through the myth of objectivity framework. Yeah, so the pieces, I guess any I guess if there's questions or kind of concerns with that that framework, feel free to jump in, of course. And so the components of active inference and free energy principle, I think, are important to my dealings here. Are the hierarchical processing, the variational component, that approximation, and then how that gets into the KL divergence. And there's one kind of more sophisticated, I guess, piece of literature, the meta awareness publication, and I have the references further down below. Yeah, but essentially specifically the components of hierarchical processing are that higher levels provide context, expected means, whereas the lower levels report errors, the update precision estimates, and I guess essentially, in a nutshell, there's a level of information compression at each level, and the higher levels coarse-grained, the lower levels are fine-grained, and set the groundwork, I think, for how we can think about symbols. Variational free energy I mentioned, computational tractable proxy for surprise, and the KL that feeds into the KL divergence, and this is the meta awareness. And so I do kind of a rejiggering of this within kind of a cultural context. But in here, kind of my takeaway was that there is a broken down in 3 layers, a particular form of attention, presumably related to human attention and cognition, where the top layer is meta-awareness, the middle layer is the attentional states, and from the bottom are traditional perceptual states. And specifically, the part that I think is interesting is the alpha, so I'll get to that in a little bit, but the alpha layer that allows the meta-awareness to toggle the precision of errors at lower levels. And so, so I'll get into how that kind of feeds in. And this, of course, is the schema from the active inference test book on the right there that shows the traditional kind of belief updating hierarchy. And so, this is one place in the fact that I honed in on to a significant degree. Maybe I overly did so, but specifically the sentence that I have kind of skipped there, which is that this line between cognitive and non-cognitive systems, they must go through that process of minimizing the divergence that we see. And so this is the act of perception. So where PFQ of X given Y, this is the true model of the generative process, whereas the Q is the approximation. And perception works by minimizing that divergence, kind of minimizing what the agent has. And what's interesting is that could be the grounds for something like sentient identity, something like the self. And I think that a good 40-minute talk could be just about this, about kind of this sentence, how that relates kind of other discussions of the self and kind of how do we identify it. And so I think it also gets into, it might track, it might also map, and this is kind of maybe an open question I have, which is how this maps to the pragmatic versus the information gain side. And so I presume that if an agent, to the extent that they perceive, their perception relies on gaining more information about the outside world, that is the epistemic side. So whereas action would come later, so they would be more associated with the pragmatic side. So this will become interesting, I think, when we think about morality not as simply a connection of not just simply something that kind of happens at the level of pragmatic value and action, but as something that is kind of truly epistemic. So I'll kind of get into that more detail. But yeah, anything I kind of got kind of glaringly wrong, feel free to stop me. Okay, yeah, the next up is the problem of symbols. And so kind of what do I mean by problem? What do I mean by kind of open questions? First kind of intuition I have here is that errors up top, and here I could be, I'm not super kind of confident in that assessment, but the way I see things is, parts of our kind of recent cognition. Maybe it's the frontal lobe, maybe it's the default mode network, but we seem to have the ability, kind of the impulse, to attend to errors at the symbolic layer, which although typically would be cast in a hierarchy as towards the top, it does seem like we have this ability to kind of rapidly refine errors, update our models, and kind of rapidly seek them out. And there's some work done on that, and so my thought was that, okay, this might connect well to the way I have things laid out in the MOH, the Myth of Objectivity. Yes, the second thing, of course, there are sparse abstracts. To model very complex systems, we can have the word cat, a whole bunch of different cats, have lions, house cats, and of course, concepts that can cover just about like everything, and in some cases, literally everything. We rapidly toggle through models, and this portion here is, how do we kind of go about doing that? And one dichotomy that I'll hone in on is the gestalt versus the analytic. And the last piece is why, kind of what motivates this, what got us into the business of symbolic abstraction, and why are we not fit to just simply adopt a few kind of high-level abstractions that would certainly minimize uncertainty. I'm a person, this is the world, maybe that's enough, this is food, but what motivates us to come up with kind of increasingly complex language models, and that's kind of, as if why is there more and more uncertainty? All right, so now I'm gonna just set the backdrop for the myth of objectivity hypothesis. So just as maybe as a refresher, yeah, but essentially the evolutionary kind of phases I have that are schematized are the intimate society. So this is what we share with chimps and bonobos and with Pan, that they model each individual within their social group. And this is according to Mark Moffat and others. So it's kind of one way of understanding the cultural niche versus the typical kind of primate social niche. So their intimate societies their societies are constrained by intimacy, by the high dimensional models they have to keep track of each conspecific. And then the next phase is tag-based groups. Well, this isn't widely accepted. It seems very plausible to me, especially kind of given what we see today, which is people are kind of born with the ability to use tag-based markers. And what does this mean? This means essentially shibboleth. What does that mean? It's essentially accent bias. And so it seems to be a phenomenon that is kind of ancient, and unlearned, so kind of something impulsive. Okay, so that what does that do? So that allows us to set up a situation where there's a prior, where our ancestors would have had priors that build in certain expectations with conspecifics that they didn't have a kind of high dimensional model of. So whereas any chimp seeing another chimp that they didn't know, it would be immediately out group. This kind of gives us some wiggle room to interact with ostensibly compatriots, but ones that we didn't quite know. So, over time, of course, this would lead to surprising behaviors where people didn't abide by certain expectations. And this is where moral typing comes in. So this is the moment I see as that kind of activation of the cultural perspective. And I'll elaborate on that last line, the cultural perspective. And so this is what I was getting to. Yes, it took me a little longer than I was hoping to get to this part, but I mean, this is the kind of main crux of what I wanted to go over today. And so there's a couple different dichotomies that are important, namely for the first two. So conceptual model divergence. So this is a way that I'm proposing we have of reducing a space. So this could be a personal experience. This could be kind of walking out and seeing the sunshine and not really having the words for it, and then coming up with some concept to describe or going through to minimize the uncertainty that we're experiencing. So it's kind of reducing an intuitive process, a high-dimensional intuitive process, to something that is a concept. And then it also works well. So the same, I think, setup works well with something like metaphor and analogy, which I'll get into. The second part, this is, and this responds to the other part of the dichotomy, which is, the first one was more the gestalt, and the second one is the analytic. And so this is where we parse not only we get the syntax and how we should represent some of these concepts using language, letters versus words, but also how we parse out separate concepts from kind of a higher level concept. So kind of going back to cat, so we have one idea of what a cat is. We can parse that into separate large cats and small cats, domestic and wild, etc. So we can essentially come up with a hierarchy of starting from one specific concept. This last part is, I guess, the most significant in terms of connecting it, the decomposition that I'm offering to the myth of objectivity. So this is the technical transcendence operator. So this is just the ability to create symbols in the fashion that we are transcending individual and dyadic perspectives. So it's not just what I think is a cat. It's not just what Christoph thinks is a cat. It'll be the idea that there is something called a cat. There is something called justice. There's something called the world, and that has meaning kind of beyond our individual perspectives. Okay, so this is how I actually tried to represent it, and hopefully it'll be a little bit more convincing by the end. But yeah, it's just to kind of lay it out there. So the KL divergence, as opposed to being the Q being the representative of the variational approximation, and the P being the true process. What I have here is two Qs. Maybe shouldn't be, but we have an intuitive high dimensional situation, and that's being compared against, diverged with the symbol. And so the idea is to kind of close that gap. That's the process of both coming up with selecting from an available set of concepts to match an intuitive experience. And also, if we replace intuitive with concept, you can compare to, or symbol 1 and symbol 2, you can compare two symbols, which is the idea of metaphor, which a lot of linguists and semioticians and others have, cognitive sciences have spoken of. And the second part is, again, that this is the error model. And so here J and K. So this J is the level. So this gets up to the connection of the hierarchy. So how we kind of pass prediction errors up the hierarchy. If computing errors, we're able to construct concepts both inherited from a higher level, and also how we can create concepts at the same level. So within the idea of cat, so you have kind of a big cat and small cat. That's just kind of two on the same level, and then kind of cat is part of cat is a mammal, cat is an animal. Those would be high level concepts. And this is kind of a quick kind of side by side comparison. EM is the analytical processing, kind of parsing a conceptual structure, and it actually does pertain to binary opposition. And there's this bit here about kind of left and right hemisphere. I know that's not kind of accepted everywhere, but assuming that there is something to it, it would be mapped out that way. All right. And so this is where I kind of learned from the kind of Gestalt and versus features, or Gestalt versus analytical dichotomy that I mentioned from John Revicki's Meaning Crisis. He explained it as the letters of the feature in the world of the Gestalt, so or the overall structure, and he kind of describes it as a pseudo-Zen problem, and his whole theory is about perspective and kind of cultural perspective, so it makes sense. But in a sense, his point here is that how do we kind of quickly toggle between both? And the point is that we have both of top-down and bottom-up modes of attention that we engage in symbolic processing for our symbolic cognition. I'll keep going. Yeah, I mean, one other. So my point here is that there's it seems to show up in several areas when people are talking about symbols. So in addition to what I had mentioned in semiotics, I'll call it paradigmatic versus syntagmatic. It's slightly different. They'll explain it in different pieces. But here I think that formulation using some of those principles and some of the fringe principles are particularly helpful, because if we can show how we can explain kind of these different disciplines that we're kind of near one another, but obviously describing it in a slightly different way.
Sorry, just 1 second. Do you maybe want to move my window to the other side or exit away, just because if people are watching the recording, some of the text might be obscured. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I didn't realize it was showing up in the Teams would have ignored it. Sorry about that. That was I was appreciating your reactions though. Sorry. Okay, so this piece here, this kind of connects to the meta awareness paper, and the kind of one nugget here that take away from is, or the two nuggets maybe, is that my understanding of the meta awareness is this is the ability to kind of view your own thoughts. And so what's one example of that? Well, it's meditation, when you focus on your breath and you're trying to desperately for anyone who's done it, you're trying to kind of desperately to focus on your breath when you're constantly distracted. And my only point was that this seems like a sophisticated approach to to kind of meta awareness. The more universal, I imagine, is kind of the picture in the back of kind of people praying together. And my point was that where does meta awareness, does it inherit from anything, or is it, is it more in other paradigms where kind of symbolic thought just kind of appears individually? It's more genetic, and I think this is the way that Chomsky views things. Perhaps another view is that kind of meta awareness evolved from something else. Of course, that would be prayer and religion and things, which kind of gets at this higher level transcendental superordinate layer. Okay, so this is the first two was CMD and EEM. This is the technical transcendent operator. I don't know that I have a whole lot of, it adds kind of too much in terms of the method, but I thought it was important just to kind of have one way to specifically say, okay, this is what's actually happening. We're shifting from an individual and dyadic perspective to one that is explicitly cultural, and that is kind of not something that happened after we became complex symbolic beings. That kind of happened immediately. And here, this is just kind of, I'll kind of get into it more a bit, but one way to, so it's the constructed objective perspective. This is the point, I guess, is that it doesn't necessarily require full-blown language. It can be simply the the assumption that behavior is not just a product of me minimizing my free energy and you minimizing yours, but that there's kind of a greater kind of shared space that we involve in that can see that we both agree on what a cat is. We both might disagree about what a cat is, but we simply are both kind of trying to arrive at the viewpoint, or maybe it's a third perspective, which is a cultural perspective. And I think this is the just like a brief reference to kind of Plato's cave analogy, and I think they kind of says a lot of what I'm trying to say here. But simply that when we have our kind of own perspectives, where you lock in a cave, we see things two-dimensionally. When someone escapes and leaves, see that there's more than just kind of shadows on the wall. Things are three-dimensional. That I see as an analog to the human enterprise. So just being able to use symbols means that we are able to kind of abstract ourselves away from the kind of modeling constraints that other species are forced upon. Or that's one way to say it. That kind of privileges our view as more accurate. Of course, you could say it another way, where we're kind of inventing and imagining things. But if we stick with Plato's viewpoint, then that is something that is that should be looked at as a privilege. And okay, and so another way to see it quickly is that I think is conducive towards modeling is that instead of again thinking of symbols as simply geared towards thought and communication, we can also think of it as a way of social classification. So hopefully this is exciting from a modeling perspective. But we have high dimensional models for intimates. We can tag people based on stereotype, and we can then then we can use morality, as I'm claiming. Still a binary kind of classification. Maybe three categories, but you have out groups, you have in groups, then you have an evil within the in group, but the moral type itself is that binary classification. And that last one is archetypes. So is someone basically basic? Are they just a normal in group member, or are they more aggressive but still in group? Then they're a warrior, right? So are they in group but they're have higher on one dimension? Then you can see how that might be useful from a kind of modeling perspective, and it kind of follows that trajectory. All right, so this is the most important slide. So if we don't have time for the rest, that's fine. We can switch because I think we are going to get into 40 minutes. So but this is what I find the most important, and it's because so how do we tie these two things together? Those kind of three those kind of three formulations: the conceptual model difference, the EEM, and that kind of technically transcendent operator. I see it happening here, right? So it's ancestor meets an ostensibly compatriot. In other words, someone who shares the same tag. So they, because of that, they engage in cooperative behavior. So they get that fitness gain immediately, and it's successful. So ostensibly, okay, we have our bounty. We've successfully achieved cooperation. However, the compatriot doesn't share spoils with the silken elderly person. And so granted, the schematized, might be more involved than the initial one, but we could, replace this with he simply harms another compatriot. But the point is that from the perspective, so although this paradigm doesn't assume that there is an actual objective perspective, of course, that there's someone kind of writing the laws for us, but it does say that that ancestor that met the ostensible compatriot has an idea of something that should be objective. And then what happens here? So the two things that happen or I guess three things happen that are important to note. So the first thing is PMD, this model divergence, shows up where the kind of left queue is the right queue, the true process, or the process that we're expecting is that, okay, well, obviously the sick person gets the food first, and that's what we expect of the hunter. However, what we observe is that the family was first, right? And so that's the divergence. But how do we know that? We know that from observing we don't have access obviously into directly in the model. What we have access to is their behavior. Right? So this is where the second side of that equation, the EEM, comes in, and that's where that kind of error is first sparked. That signal first appears, and that I think sits nicely with the kind of hierarchy, right? So we're inheriting, as I mentioned earlier, we're kind of inheriting these that alpha. Which could be the same one that is, ultimately used in meta awareness, but essentially that we're evaluating that behavior against the expectation from a cultural perspective, right? So this is, I think, the first part is kind of instantiating that that kind of TTO, or that typical transcendent operator, where the expectations are coming from above. The main point for this example, why I think it's important, is because it demonstrates that this kind of all happens at once, where we both get EEM. We're kind of parsing through cultural expectations by coming up with norms. We're also evaluating and minimizing the divergence between these two expectations, a cultural point of view from a kind of narrower, say egotistical, or say kin, or it just could be it obviously could be, he misunderstood. He had different cultural expectations, but that's not how he would view it. But the point is that it initiates the divergence between these two perspectives. And what does that sound like? Well, in my view, that sounds like moral agency. Once we get to the point where we're as kind of what I was trying to get with the picture from earlier, which is once we start shaming and not just kind of outgrouping people, and not just maybe killing deviants, once we start motivating behavior and shaming people, things like that, then what we're talking about is model selection, kind of self-model selection. That ties back to the why of this whole question. Okay, why are we interested in this sparse level, sparse modeling, a higher abstraction? Well, we're able to do it because we can transcend our own perspective. So that gives us access to this, granted imagined, but it gives us the kind of the motivation and eventually the architecture to course grade at higher levels. So on one hand, we can type people very quickly. We can turn them into moral types, archetypes, etc. But also we are motivated to do so from this kind of self-model selection, and that I think also ties back to the kind of epistemic information gain, decomposition of expected free energy, turning morality into not just a collection of specific norms, but it turns it into something more like authentic and kind of more around autism. And I have a couple slides on that, but I'll parse that through. But yeah, my point is that kind of with this one style as example, we have the kind of core components of the formula, which I see as kind of probably important for symbols. I just want to be kind of respectful of the time frame. Should I finish up, or should we the last
No, like it's fine. Like you can, it's not super strict. You can, as long as it's not overly long, like keep going for now.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, and feel free to kind of cut me off if it does get too long. So yeah, so this kind of just brings it back to the different social classification algorithm that we traversed. So we went from intimates to tags to cultural niches, and this was meant to just kind of illustrate how kind of much more expensive it is, and the kind of various gains that you get at each level. I don't think the forms aren't too important for this purpose. And so this is some of the simulations I got. This is the one that looks the cool. It's mainly why I had it here, but it does kind of show something which is interesting, which is the kind of network density goes up at its greatest in tag based. So we've become kind of a much tighter group when we have a kind of a simple tag according to the simulation, and then we lose some with the morality, and it gets completely lost in archetypes, and I'll kind of get into that what that means. But yeah, so I in that simulation, I tried to identify an area of fitness, which is just basically how successfully did two agents cooperate, assuming that there's a fitness gain from cooperation. What is the computational load, and that's kind of inherent in the assumption. So, not too much came out of that that was super unexpected. And then another interesting part came in with the kind of network structure, as I alluded to above. And so, yeah, I can talk a little bit more about the results, but the one most interesting that I'll say here is that it's the declining moral in-group percentage, which I think is interesting because although morality can be introduced as a way to stabilize an anonymous cultural group that was fragmenting, there's only so much hope we could have in kind of a simple moral paradigm. Things kind of go down quickly, so you start at pretty high rates of in-group percentages and by extension cooperation, and things kind of collapse after there. But yeah, I think that obviously it clearly has implications for other social systems that are built around morality. Of course, religion. We talk about sciences, the politics, the art. So this kind of gets into my previous talk, but I think it's kind of a good segue between this is us creating symbols, this is us kind of becoming moral and symbolic, and this is the kind of problems we create for ourselves once we kind of have this power. Yeah, so I kind of touched on some of these. I didn't mention too much some of the neuroscience data that I tried to draw on, but the N400 component, which is our ability to attend to errors, which was kind of what I was getting at originally, and wondering if that is our attention to errors is because we part of our approach to symbolic processing involves not accessing the model itself, as it were, but we're inferring a model from above, so that one of the main functions is to constantly identify errors, because the models are kind of beyond us, if you will. They're transcendent, so we don't necessarily have access to it. So it gets out of this kind of level of uncertainty that we have as symbolic agents. We can't just accept a couple symbols and kind of create them on our own, create our own kind of fantasies and live in those. They will atrophy, they will fragment over time, and it's because, or one way of explaining that is because these errors are kind of beyond us. So it was a lot to tag into the N400 component, but that's why I was interested in it. And so this is what I used kind of before. So some other cultural evidence that went into my original publication. So this is why we see the type of cultural systems that we do. Some of these are more recent and formal, like the theory of dyadic morality. Morality is cooperation by Oliver Scott Curry, and then moving into kind of cultural evolution and social institutions. And yeah, I mean, I don't want to introduce that too much, but take economics, I think, is my favorite example, where we typically cast agents as selfish, that only cooperate if there's kind of realizable, what we would call pragmatic gain. And yet there's a whole bunch of market failures according to that traditional neoclassical paradigm that aren't, I think, adequately explained by behavioral economics. We need to do something else, right? And one solution that I believe I have is the idea that we use morality and we use norms and expectations and kind of codify them to create things like firms, to create things like unions, to create things like countries that sit around the Homo economicus and linguists as well. This is moral philosophy. I feel compelled to mention moral philosophy just because if we talk about morality, then I think people kind of frequently raise, well, what is this? And I don't want to take obviously a strong position. This is meant to be an evolutionary argument, but just kind of quickly mention the deontology and utilitarianism. And another literature has, in the Digital Energy Principle, has touched on this as well, but kind of deontology and utilitarianism typically tries to resolve uncertainty and starts with kind of pragmatic gain rather than defining welfare as something that kind of already happens without taking into account how do people acquire those values, how do people learn, how do people pursue an epistemic path, etc. However, it does work well with other areas in both kind of Western and Eastern philosophy, and I kind of mentioned some of them. Obviously, we don't have time to go into too much detail, but typically the moral perspectives, particularly on the Western side, will hone in specifically on mistakes they made that are, I think, analogous to things like neoclassical economic errors, which is that the impulse to reduce uncertainty, which perhaps is Platonic forms. Everything is behind. Everything kind of exists in one format. Plato's Republic, which is okay. I'm going to reduce immorality from a state. I'm going to do that. I'm going to have people who know everything there is to know about morality, and then you have folks like Diogenes that I've listed here, who argue against that view. So I think that's obviously the best moral philosophy that fits this paradigm. And then you have kind of Wittgenstein and Whitehead, which come later in the 20th century, that essentially do the same thing that Diogenes did, which is kind of but more formally, kind of obviously. But I think they certainly did add things, but in that spirit of reducing uncertainty, they use something similar. And my favorite one is Taoism, and within the context of Confucianism and ancient Chinese philosophy, which I think this maps on very well too. So it gets at the concept of authenticity. It gets at first aligning yourself to the cultural unit, and then from there, specific norms follow. Okay. Yeah, so the kind of conclusion of future direction. So the I kind of meant to list out specifically what my questions were, but I can go over them again, but specifically kind of I'm curious if, first of all, if some of the assumptions I mentioned up top were correct, whether the line between cognitive and non-cognitive systems from I think the second chapter of the textbook, if I can interpret that as the origins of something like sentient identity, and whether that can conceivably scale to the cultural niche, and whether that kind of ties to the information gain on the expected free energy side. Also, the one other specific question I had was free energy versus something like prediction error. First of all, I don't think we actually pass by, or I was told that maybe we don't actually pass up prediction error. It's a more specific. It's the attention weight. It's the precision weight that moves around, and whether that properly represents the errors that we would use to then kind of back into higher level symbols. Whether or not this formulation works, if I had that correctly. Yeah, so kind of beyond that, if there's any other obviously comments on the decomposition that I offer, just to mention that there's testable predictions that including that social classification algorithm, whether or not we can kind of go more into that, and then the future kind of applications, which I see is one thing is topic modeling, maybe this offers something in terms, there's bird topic modeling, there's others that essentially build knowledge graphs. So could this be used for that? Or I guess two reasons. One would be an evolutionary knowledge graph, which is how our conceptual spaces has evolved kind of using the setup. And then kind of whether there's some other applications. And the last one is the publication. So, I do think this is, to the extent that it's persuasive, is an interesting kind of take on the human enterprise, the human experience. And it tells, I think, a different story than the one that I think most people have of our primary motivations, whether that's in economics, even in cultural evolution. A lot of that, I think, is there's obviously great faith that active influence in general and free energy principle in general can obviously add. And this is kind of, I think, maybe one way to connect it to the social sphere. And specifically, it does that, I think, through going through the humanities and going through kind of art and culture. And that comes down to simply that we have a perspective. And, if there's one kind of group in our modern society that is responsible for that perspective, it could be a lot of folks, but I think primarily it's the artists, and it's those folks that prevent us from kind of that collapse and only using kind of moral typing. So I just want to mention that as the final publication. Yeah, that's kind of all I had here. So I'll pass it back to you and see.
Thank you very much for that fantastic presentation. Quick round of applause. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. And I think since we are a smaller group today, I can maybe just start with some sort of broader questions and topics. So I thought a really interesting presentation. A lot of things I think touched on. Just sort of one part. Oh, could you maybe open the slides again, just that we can go through a couple of points. So share your screen again. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So one thing that I thought was just very interesting, yeah, a couple of points, but firstly, what would be your sort of explanation or your thinking behind the graphs? Yeah, we just went past them. Why you think the tag-based one is the, if I saw already, sort of the most tightly connected one? Sorry, can you hear me?
Well, he switched his microphone off.
But it doesn't appear on mute. Oh yeah, maybe you muted it somewhere else. Oh yeah, it's on mute. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe Shagor
Okay.
just
Yeah,
perfect.
there we go.
Yeah.
All right, so let me go back to sharing the screen, and I'll answer. Share screen.
Thank you.
Start. Okay. Yeah. So while that loads, to answer your question, so basically it is on one hand it could be, so I guess there's two possible explanations. So one is that the simulation was it wasn't adequate in kind of capturing the surprises and the dynamics that happen in a cultural setting. So you know, obviously there's only so much you can put in the simulation. So if you say, okay, if you're this, you know, if you sound like me, then you're an in group. If you sound different enough, then you're the out group. Then it's basically easy to find your friends. And it's probably a little bit more difficult to figure out where that falls down. Not impossible. So I feel like if I probably spent some more time and had some more conversations, we could kind of flesh out where that breaks down. However, I also think that it does kind of correspond to the intuition I have of social systems, right? So, you know, I saw an article this morning about Sweden, and it's the same article that we've all been reading. It's you know, there's a pushback against you know, large migrations and things like that. And so the point is that you know, stereotypes and shibboleth, there's both you know, practical reasons why kind of a system. So the tag-based model, right? This is stereotypes. This is people who sound like me. And so of course, this is a simplified example, but you know, cultures that are more, you know, tight knit are more tight knit. So they're more clustered. There's less surprise. So they don't necessarily have the same adaptability, the same shift that you would want to see. So in some sense, you don't necessarily want a tight knit community. You want one that is, you know, to the extent that that when I say you don't want, meaning that if you want a growing society, if you want a society that can respond to a changing climate, literally, or, you know, a changing economic climate with like different demographics, you want one with like higher GDP, more economic growth, then you want one that can kind of shift around a bit more, so that has different dynamics. So yeah, I think when you go to the moral network and when you go to the archetype network where there's no, basically I think what the simulation is saying that the more kind of tools you have to classify people, the more complicated it gets. And so, yeah, what I think this is missing is how do social systems evolve then to kind of keep people together? And this is, you know, obviously religion, this is narrative, this is, you know, culture in general, that not immediately, obviously, but like that often arises in any human society. specifically religion or the view from above, but any kind of cultural system kind of evolves to kind of keep those dots together, I think. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, and that also that reminds me. I don't know whether you've read that, but of Kashtan 2005, there was an interesting paper more like about, I guess, biological systems, but that from a certain level of size, naturally sort of subunits form to be able to deal more flexibly with changing environments, which I think is really interesting and might be to a degree transferable to non sort of itself biological systems, but more like society, which I think is really interesting. But I also thought it was so interesting because this really got me thinking. Also, what you said about sort of obviously the the element about the reduction in computational load or like difficulty in assessing people, or I guess categorizing people, and that being a lot more efficient with symbolisms. And I think that's so true, and that's also I guess what I really like the idea with the myth of objectivity hypothesis, which I think very much aligns with Harari's idea of sort of the shared myths. I really like the element that you brought into it, that it becomes sort of a collective objectivity, which I think is so true. And I mean, for example, just thinking about ideas such as, which a point also Harari makes, such as human rights. I mean, I think for many people that is almost accepted as something objectively true. But if we just take it a step further, there is actually sort of behind it nothing, I guess, in nature that really demands that. So, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's really interesting. And one thing that I thought particularly interesting, I was also curious about what you think about this, because what you said about conceptual model divergence, I think it would also like, I think you mentioned it could also essentially conceptualize the sort of how the gap between sort of personal and culture models. So how well this, I guess, this symbolism aligns with sort of personal convictions. Is that true? Would that be one way to understand this as well? Or
I think so. In a sense, I see that as the kind of foundational. What I was trying to get at was that's the foundational kind of motivation we have for engaging in these comparing other models the way that we do, the way that ends up turning into conceptual models, and that's because if someone is deviating from an expectation, what we're essentially saying is that assuming that there is this cultural prior where belonging to a culture isn't just a product of where you happen to be, where you happen to live, but really that it comes down to the belief of a target agent, then what we're saying is that they don't believe in the same culture as me. Right now, they have a narrower belief. That's one example. It could be that they're a spy that they have. That's like another obviously more evolved version. But at a basic level, my interpretation is that I guess my logic is that if two ancestors are meeting and one of them is behaving in such a way that is not in line with a cultural kind of identity belief, which is why I'm so kind of honed in on that cognitive systems versus non-cognitive systems, then we're effectively saying that they occupy a different kind of self model, and it's that divergence that kind of from which you come to morality, and then you start having and then it could be built up into something a bit more sophisticated. Does that mean a bit more sophisticated, where you have kind of obviously religion in that, and it gets more kind of abstracted. But I think at kind of a basic level, I'm happy to hear your thoughts. That made sense there.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think also it's really interesting what the or what modes of error correction would look like, because I mean, I guess, and I'm not sure I'm understanding this 100%, but I mean, like, like if we assume, I don't know, before there were any sort of further abstraction levels before society, one mode of error correction, I might be completely misunderstanding this, I'm just thinking out loud. One mode of error correction could, for example, be to create a new level of abstraction, so a new, whatever, like social group or morale, some belonging. Let's, for example, if based on a character, the group is the person, sorry, on not on character, on accent, a person is out group, but based on something else, they appear to be in group, then I don't know, a way of dealing with that mismatch could be to create another level of abstraction, a new social group. But I wonder, sort of, maybe this is maybe a little more abstract and philosophical, but I wonder whether another mode of error correction, which we are also seeing now a lot, I guess, that where we have this tendency to a lot, I mean, increasing abstraction, really, like even over the, whatever, over the 100 years through globalization and I guess the reduction of local and strong, whatever, like binding to culture, to religion, and all of that, that the symbolism becomes increasingly abstract. And in exactly this situation, I'm not sure whether that is what you meant, but I would think that this conceptual model divergence for an individual might become too large, so that the individual perception of how one feels and the identification to the abstract symbol class, that gap simply becomes too large and accrues maybe too many errors, that actually that belonging to that group doesn't work anymore, and that cohesion doesn't work anymore. And then that one form of error correction with this actually means a bit of a collapse and falling back more to local and smaller and more intense groups where the mismatch isn't as big. I don't know whether, like, this was just something that came to my mind that I thought was very, I don't know, but I'm not sure whether I'm completely misunderstanding it, but I thought a really interesting way of the way you described it, of thinking of current, I guess, problems in the world politics.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I think you're thinking exactly correctly, and yeah, and I think it's just interesting that it's just interesting that we can possibly start from this divergence and then kind of map through all the problems of the past couple hundred years, and so at a certain level, right? So it's it is the evolution of I think it works very well within Western society. So we there is dominant dominant empires, and then we have kind of dominant religion, Catholicism, and then according to kind of Joseph Henrique's overview, we start to have kind of fragmentation as soon as we have Lutheranism and Protestant religion takes over, and of course we have the history of England, super fascinating in that, where you kind of see that play out in Shakespeare. You see it playing out in Shakespeare's time. But essentially it's this. We start from a place where it's a kind of a more local society where everyone's part of the same cultural model. You enter a place where there are kind of shared. Then after following the agricultural revolution, then you have certain kind of dominant modes of religion, and you could do it in lower ways too. But obviously, with history, we'll kind of probably coarse grain more than we should in terms of civilization. But if you can think about it in terms of religion, and then so we're in a period where there's multiple religions and people are identifying with particular parts of it. And then what happens? You end up with denominations. You end up with kind of sects within religion, and then you have that certain fragmentation. And periodically it'll coalesce after a prophet. I was speaking to Daniel Friedman about this, and he said, well, you have a kind of a prophet emerges and you're going to have a new paradigm. And so I guess a lot of historical events, whether it's Western civilization or otherwise, map to this, and it essentially kind of gets at where we are now, which is sometime maybe it's postmodern, where we kind of lost a specific kind of winning religious narrative. Even in America now, for a while we had the kind of evangelical right, and that it clearly doesn't have the hold that it did before. And so what happened, our kind of political parties are basically infested. I don't know if you've been paying attention, but it's that's the way it seems, right? It's people who believe one thing are in kind of probably the wrong political party, etc. But yeah, anyways, yeah, I think it maps pretty well.
Yeah, no, I think it's super interesting, and also maybe like by continuation of that, it's interesting, I think, to maybe philosophizing a little bit, but to consider sort of like what technically really is the maximum abstraction of symbols that really work with humanity, because I guess sort of systems, physiologically speaking, but maybe beyond, essentially like need like boundaries, so difference between what's inside and what's outside. And I mean, when the groups become too large, I think this is more societally, conceptually speaking, this becomes increasingly difficult. And I just wonder, this is very maybe abstract, but I just wonder to what degree that would even be possible to have one united sort of group as humans, unless there is an out group, so to speak. Like so I don't know, I think like if we were invaded by aliens, that might be a good opportunity to create actually world cohesion, although there would obviously be people that, I don't know, create conspiracies around it whatsoever. But I think I just wonder, like, I think it's really interesting to consider what the theoretical implications of the maximum group size really would be, and how, like, in practicality and reality, that's actually possible. And I think sort of this, I don't know, I feel like this touches on these thoughts, what I thought was very interesting.
Yeah, I see that obviously as abstract and challenging, but I think that I don't know what if you know, the Ranger principle can bring us to a place where you can start to maybe simulate solutions. So there's maybe group size constraints, but you know, a lot of cultural innovations, you know, religion and I think I went through the whole thing about religion, but you know, I see religion as you know, within the remit of art, because of course the Bible was great writing, right? And so that's one of the reasons why it was so successful. You can see that about any kind of cultural text, but essentially to kind of map out how, you know, I think artists are able to create movements and create and shift people's perspectives, because I think that's the answer. And I think that there's not, you know, it's not one solution. It's not, okay, we're going to have a new religion next week that's going to reduce fragmentation. No, what it's going to take is the kind of slow building of not slow necessarily, but the introduction of kind of new maybe aesthetic movements, you know, works, and probably educational paradigms along the way that kind of let people make sure everyone's reading Shakespeare, kind of thing, or whatever it is, but or, you know, other kind of non-Western paradigms, but provide that we had the kind of correct reference. I didn't talk about referencing, but I obviously could have. But once we kind of have the right language and the kind of right you know, motifs that'll help us build priors, not for the stakes in themselves, but so that we can create and all kind of, you know, properly, quote unquote, interpret works of art given the cultural element. So I feel like today, if someone came out with a show versus if they came out with it, you know, 50 or 100 years ago, it'd be harder for that show to, you know, speak to you know, some of the ways that we're fractured, and it's because we all kind of have our own kind of priors with you know, with regard to kind of art and culture, and then we have our own kind of Netflix channels, and we have our own streaming apps, and you know, et cetera, et cetera. So anyways, yeah, that's what I see as kind of the problem. And which I think you can kind of formulate in these terms.
No, yeah, that's super interesting. And I don't know whether you've like looked into Peter Turchin, but I think he also says like that there is a risk of fragmentation when abstraction exceeds sort of emotional resonance, which I think makes a lot of sense. And I think he's done some work on that. Just two more small points I had. One, oh, actually just one more point, I think. Yeah, and I really like the application, I guess, to Taoism and Confucianism. I don't know whether there's a really cool, you mentioned Alan Watts. There's a really cool book by him called The Way of Zen, which I think is a really really cool introduction to Zen. making it sort of understandable from a Western mind. And in the beginning, he draws exactly that parallel between Confucianism, which essentially is the idea that like harmony is created through conventionality, and how subsystems, mostly obviously societal systems, can work together, or ideally through matter of convention. So I mean that would be language, but that would be law, that would be morals and all of that stuff. And Zen, standing pretty much in contrast with that, I think also, as you mentioned, or Taoism, that rejecting conventionality, which I think is also, yeah, it's interesting because I don't know, it's I don't necessarily want to say that. Yeah, I mean, actually, Alan Watts does say that, or I think there's also a conviction in general, sort of in Taoism, that it's not a concept or principle that's fit to reign, I don't know, societies. In the book, it's actually being described as a pursuit of older men that decide to step out of society. Yeah, which I also think fascinating, and also just considering the, I don't know, the merits, and also just depending on different situations and circumstances, the pros and cons of different approaches. But I thought that connection was very nice as well.
For sure, yeah. And I think it maps well to the expected free energy between epistemic and exploitative, or information gain and pragmatic value, where in Taoism you're the focus is on kind of finding yourself, and kind of being true to the person you are, right? And I think it's so powerful for us in Western societies to read, because we're suspicious of people kind of in the wild and completely disconnected from society, whereas the pragmatic side is more on the Confucian elements, and I kind of like how and I just don't think we have a great we have the same dichotomy, but I just think Chenning's philosophy, because it has Confucianism on one hand and Taoism on the other, it just has kind of a good way of laying out, because saying well, if everyone kind of went into the woods and found themselves, that'd be problematic. But if people, if select people do that from time to time, it's kind of good for society to be more adaptable, assuming we're optimizing for the cultural and not for the individual. But anyways, it's a good kind of dichotomy that I think maps well with what we have. So yeah, no, I appreciate you asking about that.
No, that's I think it's really cool. And just a last point I actually mentioned, and I thought that's what I was saying initially. I think there are a lot of things that can neatly sort of slot onto the things that you said, and that reflect modern culture, I think, very interestingly and well. And the last point that I just said, because I think you also mentioned sort of, yeah, the increasing computational load in depending on the form of, I guess, sort of social cohesion or norms or way of classification one has. And I think, I don't know, that just made me thinking about the idea that I mean, I guess in the modern culture, if we look at the different graphs, is definitely one of the more abstract ones, or like where the symbolism is more abstract. And I was just thinking, because obviously, like, anxiety is a big topic, talked about a lot, and many young people, I guess there's an increase in anxiety, which I think partly also has to do with more diagnosis, but I think might also reflect an actual state. And I was just thinking, and maybe, I don't know whether you have any thoughts about this or something, whether some people might still, and including actually myself, I would say, be trapped in the intimate model, trying to model every other person's state, internal states, to a degree that would be appropriate for an intimate model, but which simply isn't practical in the sort of social structure that we have at the moment, which I think is the source of much anxiety, because it's, I don't know, it's computationally just taxing, I guess, or cognitively taxing, and B, it's also just kind of, it obviously completely overshoots what is required to interact at the level that our society works, because it's really, if someone else doesn't like you, it doesn't matter most of the time. And I think that, or at least to me, that would feel like it explains, or could be one source of explanation for much of, or like a root of anxiety some might feel in this mismatch where we've come from and where we currently are.
Yeah, no, yeah. Well, that's great because I hadn't, because I obviously like thought a lot about, okay, well, we need a sophisticated kind of cultural reference frame, and I think we do, for all that we gain from the shift to a kind of religious worldview to a more of a scientific and objective worldview, we lose some of the tools that we had of, engaging both kind of compassionately with people and positively, but also putting people into some groups and having that advantage, yeah, to your point, yeah. The other thing that we I guess what we end up doing, yeah, is so we don't have tools and we still don't want to judge people all as bad, or we don't want to be cynical. Then one option is to no, I'm going to carve out people as intimate models, and maybe like in the with the internet, with social media presence, with LinkedIn, like you can kind of, you can think you can, it seems like you can do it. You can't, right? Obviously, because as systems get more complicated, we become, as our information explodes, we become equally more complicated, so it becomes harder to do that. But that's a great that's a great fact that I hadn't thought about. We're kind of falling back to higher dimensional models. One way of understanding anxiety. I like that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. A lot of I think that there would be an infinite amount of things to tag on, but I do think unless there are any questions, I think it would be time to pass on the torch to you, Carl. I've made a couple of notes about further questions that Shagor had, but I'm sure you've made those yourself. Or remember.
Yes, I know. I don't make notes at my age, but admire those people who do. Good. So it's my turn now, is it?
I believe it is.
Okay, lovely. Yeah, we probably don't need the screen anymore. Yeah. So excellent. Thank you. That was a particularly enjoyable presentation, and particularly the discussion afterwards was some of it I didn't understand, but I learned a little bit and heard some names and ideas that I had not come across before. So I've going to take a slightly more pragmatic approach in terms of my summary, largely because I can't summarize some of the things that you were talking about. But what I can do is just ground the discussion and the presentation in terms of what you want to do with this, and if you want to do simulations or apply it practically, what would be the best way to do that? So can I ask you, is this work a prelude to, or has it already been written up as an academic paper, or is it a backdrop to some application or software development kit, or something that is going to that would actually be more comfortable in a company setting, or are you looking to write in the social sciences and philosophy literature, or do you want to get into the technical machine learning literature? Well, so I'm just trying to get a feel for what you want to do, what you want to accomplish in terms of socializing or democratizing the things that you've been talking about.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So the last time we spoke, I was wondering if maybe I should try to kind of do a part-time PhD or something like that and go into academia. And one thing you suggested was just kind of writing a book. And so yes, my goal would be is to kind of present a new perspective, get people interested in it somehow. And my thought was that, well, one way to kind of excite people about this, and maybe some of the interim steps are what you mentioned. So I think an academic paper, perhaps a simulation, and if I can convince folks, other folks who are familiar with active inference, or other folks who might not be, if I can interest them, then I think that there'd be people interested in the book. So that's the I guess long-winded answer, not super specific, but
right. Okay. Well, it's quite specific. So ultimately you'd like to write a monograph or a book that may be preempted, and you will be able to test the water through hypothesis pieces in the academic literature that may or may not be substantiated with numerical studies based on simulations. While we're here, can you just tell me what those graphs represented? You talked about simulations, but what you showed are just four directed graphs. What were the vertices and what were the edges, and how did you get to them?
Yeah, the ones I showed, if I can just put them up on that, it was that specific one was a network graph, and it was meant to show.
No, I can remember them, so don't worry about showing
Sure.
them again. Just tell me how you constructed them.
I mean, yeah. So it was through Python, and the network graphs were designed to show the number of interactions between agents, and so and the other ones were, so it started with cooperation rates. So how many people would engage in it started with interactions, so like the number of interactions you would have with other people in a particular group as the group size increases, and so the axis would be the number of interactions. The next one was cooperation rates, so the number of cooperative interactions you would have, and the subset of those that would be fitness gains was the fitness test. And so that's kind of roughly what I did. Does that answer everything now?
Well,
so
they were based upon adjacency matrices scoring the number of interactions over some period of time and the nature of those interactions. Where did you get that data from, or was it the result of a simulation?
It was simulation.
How did you simulate the interactions?
Oh, through just in Python, through I tried using PyMDP, but then I ended up using something else. But I used a different Python library that ran the simulations.
Right. So what were the basis of the simulations? If it wasn't PyMDP, I presume it wasn't active inference. So it was. How did you specify whether the probability of an interaction between two individuals in the simulation?
I used it during 1 second. It was.
Are you looking at your code or your notes?
Exactly. Yeah.
You can't answer like that. Suggests to me that it's probably work out why you want to show a figure like that and the story you want to tell. Don't call it a simulation if it's just a picture of a story you want to tell. So if you're trying to tell a story that the sort of the fine grainedness or the scale of in which we now categorize other people can have a profound effect on their coupling or interactivity. Borrowing from, say, network theory or graph theory, just say that. Otherwise, somebody like me will think, well, okay, so what am I looking at here? What were the first principles that underwrote these interactions? Do they have, is there something deeper going on? Are you trying to show the emergence of something? That's why I was asking, and you couldn't answer. So that suggests to me that you weren't trying to demonstrate the emergence of a scale-free kind of interactivity as measured by the number of social media exchanges or the number of cooperative exchanges in an economics game, that you just wanted to make a point. So I think that practically has relevance, because you need to make a decision. Are you going to invest in time actually doing simulations, numerical studies, that will substantiate the points you want to make, or do you just want to provide a narrative argument that it could be this way, and this narrative argument is predicated on the first principle account offered by active inference and the free energy principle, but doesn't actually need any numerical simulations. I can tell the story just by using intuition, stories, and possibly the occasional equation, just to provide the functional form or the basis of how I'm carving up the different sort of processes that might be involved in group formation or cultural niche construction, or whatever you want to however you want to frame it. So that would be one sort of practical thing I think you need to consider. What are you actually going? How are you going to tell this story? Are you going to get into the weeds and actually simulate people placing some epistemic trust in somebody else who may or may not be like me, and do that with 1,000 agents and see the emergence of the coarse graining of the way that we characterize and typify people? And is this helped by having institutions? Is it helped by having language? Is there an optimal number of different personality types that would depend upon the actual is a diversification of the different kinds of person I can be dependent upon the fine grainedness of the way that we classify people, or bring sort of stereotypes or to the table to impose those things. Wonderful point about sort of the move from a theistic or religious kind of imposing Platonic forms on people to a more scientific one, which doesn't have that kind of well-established frame. And has that made a difference over the past 50 years, for example? But to answer that kind of question with simulations, you'd have to get into the weeds. I get the impression that's not what you want to do, because you couldn't answer my question when I asked you how you made your simulation. However,
my thought was my thought was that, well, if you start with something kind of basic, where you're essentially just kind of illustrating the assumptions that you made. So it's if an intimate model will have will have 100 dimensions, and a tag model will have 2 or 3 or 4, then you'll get
yes,
higher.
I think that's absolutely right. So the reason you use numerical simulations is to demonstrate that these things are emergent properties, and to illustrate particular points. So I'll give you one example, which comes from your last exchange, which again was really interesting. It's shall we go into that at the moment? Let me just back up a little bit and feed back to you from the point of view of the mechanics that you would need to clearly identify and associate with various kinds of belief updating processes that underwrite the phenomena you're talking about. It strikes me that there were 3 things you wanted to pull apart, and those were the 3 things in, and I remember this correctly, the first one was in the KL divergence that appeared a couple of times between those things, between my current posterior beliefs and those that would inherit from a categorization. Then there was the error correcting thing that had the that was basically a belief updating based upon some mismatch or prediction error based upon observations. And then you had your transcendental thing, which seemed to be more about sort of precision control and contextualizing inference in a deep generative model. Was that roughly the 3 things that you had? So I was just thinking, how would I relate that sort of 3 distinct mechanisms that may be really important in terms of multi-agent simulations, and all the ensuing epistemic and pragmatic or instrumental interactions that you might get and might be co-constructed through those interactions. And I think the simplest way to do that is to take the first one and say that this is an emergent property of hierarchical inference, given a particular characterization or archetyping or stereotyping of the kinds of things that I could see, very much along the lines of cats being animals, hierarchical composition of things that are brought to the table to explain a particular instance that you've observed. So this is just classification under or recognition of things under deep or hierarchical generative models that have this sort of categorical structure to them. The second error correcting one, I think, would be probably, it wasn't absolutely clear because of the functional form of your equations, and I'll explain why it wasn't clear. But I think what you've done there is actually move to an even a different kind of problem, which was the structure learning problem. So you're talking about the very structure of the generative model itself in terms of how many levels does it have and how many, for example, slots do you have to categorize this person? And you were talking about, having too many or too few. And from my mind, also you were discussing the difficulties young people have now in terms of the diversity of different ways that people could come across. So all of this really is basically the problem of structure learning. How many slots do I have in terms of being able to assign you to one of a finite number of kinds of person? Because once I've inferred the kind of person you are, I can now contextualize all my interactions with you, or not, or I can not interact with you. If I can identify that you're sufficiently like me, then we can talk. If you're not, then we can't talk. So, being able to categorize people in this particular way is absolutely crucial, I think, for sort of interactions of the kind you're talking about. But notice, in foregrounding the importance of this is not a problem of inference or of learning from the point of view of the numerical simulations or the mathematics of active inference and learning. This is a problem of model selection, where you're selecting the very structure and the form of the model itself, where that form entails how many levels do you have, how many dimensions do people do you have, how many factors in discrete state space models within each factor, how many bins do I have. So in a social factor, how many different how many social types are there? This person is one of those, this person is one of these, this person is one of those. In an intimacy factor, this person could be very familial factor. This person could be very closely related. It's a distant relative. It's not a member of my family, but it's a family friend. So what kind of coarse graining do you bring to the table? And I repeat, that is a really profound and really interesting question, but it is a question that lives at the level of structure learning. So I would cast the second part, that error minimization, not in terms of predictive coding and precision weighting of prediction errors from the sensorium or the observation, and I have a very particular reason for suggesting that, but more about basically the differential errors that you would make with and without adding a new category to your to the way that you've carved people, carved nature at its choice in terms of the kind of people that they can be. And this is, I repeat, a problem of structure learning. And I think that would allow you now to talk about, for example, now I'm going back to the example that you could use simulations. So how many different kinds of people should I carve my social sphere or my social media sphere into? There is a principled answer to that. And the answer is the structure which defines the model is the best structure is that which has which entails the model with the highest model evidence, or the smallest expected free energy. And that mathematically can be read in many different ways. For example, the expected free energy is the mutual information between my classification and the data that is generated by the things that I have classified. For example, that's one way that a machine learning person would understand it. Another approach would be if I choose 4 ways of classifying people in this particular social context or along this particular dimension. So it can be one of 4 personality types, for example. Then that is, if that particular binning, as opposed to 5 or as opposed to 3, has the highest evidence, which means that that is the simplest account of the nature of other people that affords an accurate explanation of everything that I witnessed that this person generates. So this is the log evidence equals accuracy minus complexity. The only thing we want to do is to maximize our adaptive fitness in this cultural social eco niche. And that just means maximizing my marginal likelihood of my model of the world, which just means maximizing the evidence, which just means minimizing the complexity, the number of bins, that whilst at the same time maintaining accuracy, that I'm not making any prediction errors when it comes to the lowest level. So that means that there's an inverted U function over the fine-grainedness of the different conceptual categories that you can assign to people that you can now simulate. So now you can now simulate how many is it and what depends, what underwrites, because of course the model evidence just depends upon the data. So you'll get a different answer depending upon the data. But where the data come from? Well, it comes from other agents trying to do their structure learning. So now you've got this circular causality that there is going to be a self-constructed, optimal, free energy minimizing, model evidence maximizing solution, which will entail the number of different types that this particular population entertains. And of course, exactly as one of your narrative points was intimating, if we now have a shared generative model where we can now articulate these types and communicate them, I now know that you use 4 types and I've used 4 types, and that's going to now mean that in order to minimize our joint uncertainty, we're both going to conform to one of 4 types. So we're actually going to coarse grain ourselves just because we're actually now sharing the same generative model. That can be communicated. So you've now got communication as an essential part of the way that we understand and interact with and classify each other. So then you ask yourself, well, okay, if I was going to simulate this, what would I vary? And then you get down to the nitty-gritty of, well, the only thing that characterizes the difference between you and me are my prior preferences. So now I'm going to build a community that has very homogeneous prior preferences versus a community that has more dispersed or heterogeneous prior preferences, possibly due to different geographical or other, and then just change that and see how that affects the coarse graining and the way that your things evolve. And then you can start to get to your argument, well, we've needed to change our religious versus scientific or to model that effect. I've effectively now gone in there and removed an existing categorization, now seeing what emerges when we now actually transact in a different context that does not include churches, but now includes online scientific discussions. So that provides a different kind of data and a different kind of conformity or non-conformity, Zen versus the opposite. So that would be an example of what you could do with a simulation. However, I think you can be just as powerful in terms of engaging people and making them think along these lines, just by saying, you could do these simulations. So what I'm suggesting is you don't have to actually do your PhD and learn how to use PyMDP, or in fact, you wouldn't be able to do it with PyMDP. You'd have to get Connor Hines to re-engineer PyMDP to do this for you. You could engage Peter in Aarhus to do the Julia package. That might, but it would take you months and months, I think, and lots of collaboration to actually simulate these things. But in a day, you can write down a proposal for somebody who is skilled in deploying, simulating multi-agent interactions under active inference principles. But you've moved well away from just simple active inference. We're now talking about structure learning and the circular causality between the different levels. One of the reasons one of the reasons that I think it's important to distinguish between structure learning and just standard learning in terms of reinforcement learning and the like, which is just optimizing the parameters of a particular model, given that you've structured it, given you've done your carving. There are only 4 types of people here, is that I think it does separate the different scales of optimization. So you basically, the scales of optimization will be sort of inference, which is a very fast kind of thing, inferring the states of affairs. There'll be learning, which is slightly lower. I have to accumulate a lot of inference updates in order to learn the contingencies and the parameters of my generative model. And then the selection is the next slowest thing. So having learned and having been a good phenotype and disclosing to the environment my adaptive fitness in terms of evolutionary psychology or cultural co-evolution or niche construction, then you've got this very slow, almost evolutionary time scale kind of selection pressure, where sort of types and memes about different kinds of people evolve much more slowly than I learned to ride a bike, which itself is a much more slow process than inferring certain states of affairs, moment to moment in terms of perception. So if you can tease that out, I think that's an important aspect of this sort of transcending different scales, which was, I thought, a common theme of your presentation. And in particular, I repeat, the particular sort of scale-free or invariant aspect you're talking about here is over time, as you get to these hierarchically higher or deeper levels. From the point of view of the maths, the functional form of your equations, I think it's going to need a bit of revision. You conflated predictive coding with belief propagation, so you can't have. You can't talk about discrete state space models of the sort where there are categories and things are either in this state or in that state. You're an adversarial person, or you're a collaborative person. You're blue or you're red. I am happy. I am embarrassed. I am sad. These are all concepts that have a semantics, and they have to have a semantics. In order to have a semantics, they have to be categorical. We have no language that would report the length of a piece of string to within a millimeter. We do actually. We just decimate it and coarse grain it into 1.72 whatever. But there's a fundamental distinction between state spaces that we deal with when we move and state spaces that we deal with when we work through concepts. And that conceptual state space is a discrete state space, and that, because it's discrete, you can now put a semantics on. If you put a semantics on, you can now talk about it and you can broadcast that. From your point, well, no, not from your point of view, but from my point of view, or the point of view of somebody actually using PyMDP, for example, the message passing that is entailed by that belief updating is not predictive coding. So you can't talk about prediction errors. You have to frame it in terms of KL divergences, which is why I was encouraging you to take the error stuff Yes, it's at the highest level, but highest in the sense that it's actually the selection of the very model itself. It's not part of the learning. Once you get into the world of message passing, variational message passing, and belief propagation, that is the right mechanics for discrete state-space models, which is not predictive coding. So there's no precision weighting of the sort that, well, that's not true, but simply precision weighted prediction errors are just not part of the story. So you can't write that down. So how would you articulate, how would you rewrite your equation to accommodate both the first part, which was important, and the transcendental part that had the alphas in it? And I'm assuming that the transcendental part was more about attention, so balancing the importance of the different preconceptions or prior beliefs in relation to the sensory evidence, as scored by that KL divergence in the first term. I think what I would do is just stick to the functional form for the free energy, which very simply is a likelihood, which is the expected probability of the data conditioned upon their causes. And in a deep model, it's its causes at the first level. Then so that's the likelihood, and then it's the priors, and then it's the entropy. But the priors and the entropy come along at each level, and can be written down as a KL divergence, namely the complexity posterior and the prior at each level. And the beautiful thing from your point of view is that basically means you can write down your KL, but what you put into it is a dependency on one level on the level above. So instead of having, I was just looking at your functional form with two Qs, then the key thing is that the first Q is an approximate posterior, and the second Q now becomes a P, a probability over this level conditioned upon a higher level, and that provides the context. So this context, this higher level, could indeed, in fact probably will be, exactly the thing you're doing your structure learning from. So just knowing that people can come along in these flavors at a higher level means that you've now got these empirical constraints on the probability that they're acting like this at the lower level. And now you form beliefs about how they're acting at the lower level, say X superscript N, which is basically going to be under minimizing free energy, will be minimizing the KL divergence between Q over X at this level N and the prior belief, which is the probability of the person acting at this level X to the power N, conditioned upon the categories afforded by the carving the world of nature at its joints, which here will be X at level N plus 1. So you can now nicely write down this contextualization that inherits from higher and higher in your pyramid, carving nature at its joints. And at each level, you're providing contextual constraints on unpacking in a more detailed way all the posterior beliefs. And that's true all the way up and all the way down. And that means you can just write down the free energy functional in the completely normal way. It's just accuracy minus complexity. And the complexity is just a KL between the posterior Q and the priors P. But crucially for you now, P is now going to be conditionally dependent on the level above. So now you have another term, which is the level above. So it's Q of the level above, now KL'd with P of the level above and the level above that. And then ad infinitum, or up to the depth that you want. And of course, the depth you want is for you the top of your pyramid, the very high level stuff. So on that view, the prediction errors basically become the KL divergences. So you're minimizing prediction errors all the way up and all the way down in an internally consistent way, where the depth of the model is just there in order to provide empirical priors or constraints that enable you to to provide an accurate account of what's going on and to maximize the evidence for your particular model. Then the final, I was thinking, how would you put your transcendental into that? If I was you, I would actually now put the alpha, the A, inside the inside the KL divergence. Now you can do that because the KL divergence is it's a difference in log probabilities. So when you multiply by a precision, when you increase the precision of a probability, you're basically multiplying the log probability. So I think you can put your transcendental bit inside the KL divergences. So for example, you could say that I've now got a very flexible, deep generative model where my prior beliefs at each level are basically tuned to be more or less precise given the context. And that means that my priors are now multiplied by alpha, but alpha now has to be inferred, and alpha now depends upon the level above, or could be, to come back to your sort of jump from the top to the bottom. It could be at every level, it could be dependent on the top level. And then you've got your sort of deep structure that you were referring to in terms of the precision, which is now basically multiplying a log prior. But in fact, yes, a log prior in this instance now depends upon the mental action and the categorization and the sense making at much deeper levels. This is a bit technical, but if I was reviewing this, I would be alarmed at the functional forms you're bringing to the table, because they're just not you can't talk about prediction error, so you're talking about sort of categorical state space models or partially observed Markov decision processes. But I did like the hierarchical construction and the abstraction, but you really need to make that simple and explicit. It's already there in deep generative models. You don't need to invent any new functional forms or any new functionals. What you need to do is to say, look, we now need to think seriously about how to read this, these deep generative models, the hierarchical models, and in particular, equip them with a particular kind of parametric depth, which is this sort of A, or precision, which means I can tune, I can contextualize certain prior convictions or assumptions in a context-sensitive way, as long as I render some of my precisions dependent upon the level above, very much like the left-hand side of the diagram you showed, I presume first based upon Lars Sandberg Smith's work. Yeah, so you just want to basically get that notion into your equation, and then you've just got one equation, which is a standard expression for free energy, but unpacked hierarchically, and then equipped with your precisions as explicit variables. And then you can talk about the second two and just say that this only works. It only works when I've got this deeply informed generative model that has this ability to have, to contextualize my inference in the best kind of way, and in a way that has all the compositionality and the depth required to understand everything, including other people. Furthermore, I've now equipped it with this transcendental mechanism that allows me to attend again in a context-sensitive way. So I can contextualize not only in terms of the actual content of the data, but also in terms of how confident I am in this given context, which could clearly change if I change my social media channel or move country or something, or X came along and replaced Twitter. And so you just now got one simple equation, which is just the vanilla free energy equation, but slightly unpacked, tell the story you want to. And then that leads to structure learning. And the structure learning now is inherent, because you can slip into your free energy equation conditioning upon the model. So the model itself now can also be optimized, and the question now is, what's the right rhetoric for that? And it's usually structure learning on basic model selection, and then we go back to the argument we talked about before, which is basically how many levels, and that's really a tricky question when we're actually predicating the best coarse graining of our concepts of other people on the basis of data. that we are co-generating and co-constructing. So there's some really interesting issues that you could then pursue there. I'm talking quickly because I'm aware this is being recorded, and you're probably both getting very bored. What I'm going to do is just give you a couple of papers that sort of provide a bit of flesh and functional forms or numerical examples of what I'm talking about, so that you can either read them, and you probably read them already, but read them in the basis of this feedback and think about how you could actually do one of these things, or probably more easily and more efficiently in terms of time, describe to the reader how this kind of thing can be done. So there's a clear path in terms of how to, I repeat, socialize, democratize, and engage the wider community in this approach in a practical way. So I'm going to grab the screen and just quickly, if I can. Right, can you see this?
Yep.
I'm just thinking about, I'm not quite sure. I did notice that you're already in charge of building products, and I imagine that some of your theorizing gets into your day job as well. So I don't know what kind of pro bono work you're doing, or whether this is weekend academic work. But there is an initiative funded by the European Union, which would fit very comfortably with some of your interests. That's pursued by a colleague of mine. He originally tried to engage who's our project partners. But it's the reason I just sort of put this up is if you were interested at any point in engaging or doing pro bono work for them, they are an international consortium that are funded by the European Union to understand the mechanics of voting, basically, but more generally, social interactions and the way that we conceive of each other, but using empirical data from voting in America. So I'm just sort of highlighting this as one particular community that you might want to engage and collaborate with, should that be of interest in the fullness of time. So Louis Bravo is the lead investigator. It probably tells you that somewhere here. These are the people who are involved in Europe. I'm afraid it's not American, I'm afraid, but it is still an international initiative. This is, I'm sure you've seen this. I'm sure Mao has. Oh dear, I've broken it. So this would be sort of state of the art 2 or 3 years ago of simulating the emergence of types and the circular causality in terms of how do I update my beliefs on the basis of interactions and communication when I communicate selectively with things that are like me. And if I remember, I'm pretty sure that Connor actually handcrafted that in, that there was, interactions were conditioned upon the degree to which you were like me, and that manipulating that particular prior in the generative models enabled them to show the emergence of sort of polarized dyslexic or almost alexithymic, sort of you're good or you're bad, or you're blue or you're green in this instance, versus more subtle kinds of sort of carving formation of different groups that, and I suspect from your point of view, you would now want to do this, but actually look at the sort of scale-free architecture, look at sort of small world emergence of small world graphs, very much in the spirit of the graphs that you showed us, the 4 different structures, and asking what are most fit for purpose. Did somebody sort of point you to this work, Epistemic Communities Under Active Inference?
Yes, yeah, at some point.
Good, excellent. So that would be the kind of numerical simulation that I would advance. Another kind, which now, so that was just about learning and belief updating, given a generative model. This particular body of work Do you know Ryan Smith? Have you come across Ryan Smith at the Laureate Institute in America?
No.
Yeah, I'm not sure. You know whether he's still operating in this space. But he's in America. I'm assuming you're in America. Then, so this particular work, I think, speaks much more to what you were discussing earlier on in terms of the structure learning and carving people into types. And the example here, I should just say that sort of, there are generally that kind of problem mathematically has been around for a long time, right from the days of evolutionary thinking in terms of species discovery. So imagine you went to a new island and you had no idea what kind of people you're going to meet there. How many different types of people might you expect to discover? And this is exactly the same problem that Darwin had when he was going around on the Beagle, trying to work out how many new species have I discovered. So this is called a species discovery problem, and there's lots of really interesting statistics underneath it. So, if I've seen 100 things like that and 5 of those and 2 of those, how many species am I likely to be? How many different kinds of people are there? So you can actually use very early statistics to motivate what subsequently became known as non-parametric Bayes. So non-parametric Bayes, you assume that there can be an infinite number of people. But in the first instance, I'm going to ignore all but the fact that there are 2 kinds. And if the next person that comes along doesn't fit into those 2 types, I give them another table, another slot. So now I've got 3 types. And then if that's good enough, then everybody I encounter can now be put into one of these 3 slots until a 4th kind of person comes along, and I can't provide an accurate account of them unless I now introduce a 4th slot. And then you keep on going. But of course, as you keep on going, the probability of discovering a new kind of person starts to decrease under particular priors about the probability that this is a completely new example of this kind of person. Just for you forget about this, but just for your interest. So if you assume that there could be an infinite number of different kinds of people, you can actually use what are called stick breaking processes to provide priors on the probability that this person deserves their new table. And the reason I use the analogy of a new table is that the classic stick breaking process is a Chinese restaurant process, where the problem is, do I go and sit at a new table, or do I try and join my friends and colleagues at an existing table? And of course, if all the tables are full, I have to go and start a new table. So that's why you can write that down mathematically as a Chinese restaurant process. But more generally, that's sort of they call stick breaking process. How many times can you break a stick? So usually it's 6. So usually there are 6 kinds of things in this world. You can only fold a piece of paper 6 times. So my guess is that most of these canonical Platonic personalities in one dimension will have between sort of 2 and 6. I would imagine. Interestingly, so Ryan sort of said, well, does it have to be one of these non-parametric Bayes? Could we not just assume that we have, say, 8 slots, and we'll just use that 1 slot when we meet somebody that we can't put into an existing slot, on the basis of a model with and without that extra slot, and then choose the model with the highest evidence, comparing a model with and without the slot. And that works very nicely. So that would be the modern way of doing this kind of structural learning. And he actually illustrated it using a very simple example of concept learning using, I think, PyMDP. So this would be an example that you could, if you wanted to, do with PyMDP that speaks to the structure learning issues that you were talking about, and then evaluate, should you want to, the number of personality types or conceptual types emerged in a dyadic context. But I repeat, I think that might be a waste of your time. You've got other talents. I think a narrative account would be better, and just refer to this as this kind of paper as an example of what could be done if people were to take these ideas seriously, and what would likely ensue. But if you wanted to, see if Ryan is up for a collaboration, or certainly if he can send you his favourite papers along this. Interestingly, he's particularly interested in psychiatry, and in particular emotions. And for him, the number of different emotional types you can have is very important, particularly from the point of view of the patient. So if you're the kind of person who's failed to carve this emotional space properly, you end up as being either alexithymic or dyslexithymic. So you're the kind of person that sort of feels either good or bad, and there's no shades of grey. Whereas if for you and me, we have all different kinds of ways of categorizing and understanding and recognizing various emotional states. And if we can do that, then we can contextualize and use our transcendental mechanisms to deploy the right attention and do the right, say, interoceptive inference as well as our exteroceptive inference. So there's an interesting point of contact there, I think, between sort of emotional inference and possibly social inference of the kind that you're contending with. I just put this up just as a nice example of the evolutionary pressures on recognizing out of sample behaviors, and how on earth it is that certain behaviors seem to be transmitted transgenerationally when we are predisposed to ignoring atypical kinds, and possibly are atypical or surprising behaviors. So again, it's a completely narrative account based on paleoanthropological expertise. Is this a nice example of how we do? In this particular instance, it wasn't culture, it was hand axes. Where on earth did a tool come from, and how did we all share that? So I just put that up as a particular example from a different field that may or may not be interesting. This is another example of the kind of simulations that you might want to do. I did notice that you had some nice demonstrations in terms of the percentage of people that would belong to a group. If I can't quite remember. This paper, again, I know we're running out of time, but I put this paper up because it offered similar kinds of numerical simulations, but in this instance, having a small number of agents who were exchanging under the principles of active inference. So the only imperative was to maximize the evidence for their generative models, but in the special context, they could actually broadcast their beliefs, their posterior beliefs, to each other. And what this simulation was about was to show that their understanding of the other, in fact, there were just 3 agents in this instance, was an emergent property as they aligned the mapping from their beliefs, their posterior beliefs, to what they were saying. So this particular paper was basically saying that language is an emergent property of self-evidencing agents that are all sharing the same environment and the same sensorium. So if you share your eco-niche, and this is an acoustic and visual eco-niche, then if you want to find that joint free energy minimizing solution or joint marginal likelihood maximizing solution, i.e. everything is as aligned and as predictable as possible, then you get language emerging. And that language basically is just one statement that there can be a semantics associated with discrete states of the world, but that semantics only emerges when I can actually share it with you. It just depends upon having aligned, in this instance, likelihood. Right? And you can illustrate that in terms of children, in this instance, children acquiring language from their parents, but then the children becoming parents and then transmitting it to the next generation, and then look at the emergence and the alignment of various things as time goes on. So that was federated inference and belief sharing, as an example of a numerical study where you could highlight or point to the fundamental things that you're. I'll just skip to this one because I can't get to the other one. This is just for entertainment. I liked your rewriting of the predictive coding scheme with precision sort of in play, which I presume later became the transcendental part. And it just reminded me of Chris Field's, or this figure from Chris Field's work on the inner screen model of consciousness, where we were making exactly the same point, that part of the message passing in a deep generative model crucially depends upon setting the precisions, the blue arrows here, which in this instance was related to covert action in exactly the same way I think you were trying to intimate. You've got this transcendental effect in these deep models where you can actually contextualize the precision or the confidence placed in various messages. But in this instance, it was applied to consciousness. And this instance, although Ramstead was the first author, in fact, this has been rewritten, and Chris Fields now is the first author, and he was the architect of this inner screen, which is an inner Markov model, which for you will be the top of the pyramid. It'll be the deepest, most, if you like, irreducible Markov blanket defining a particular hierarchy. Why am I putting this up? Yeah. So if I were you, I'd take your second error-based imperative and take that out of free energy minimization in terms of inference and learning and put it into structured learning and model selection. Do I add a new category or not? And then if you did that, you can now express your error in terms of the expected free energy, so it's still an E, with and without this extra component, and that will give you a prediction error in terms of expected free energy that will allow you to decide whether you should or should not grow your model or not. And so this is the kind of technology that I referred to before that Ryan Smith was using when he was doing his concept learning. So it's just generalized. And so without too much fiddling with your equations, I think you can get the same spirit in, but now you can specialize it and specify it in terms of this is about the model. So it's a prediction error is about the model having accumulated all the observations. And that's equation 9 in scale-free active inference that has some other aspects which you might like or refer to, because it is explicitly about how to learn deep generative models that have that compositionality that you were referring to as you get increasingly abstract as you move up. But I repeat, the reason I'm putting this to you is so that you can borrow or copy the equations. It's gone away now. Borrow the copy of the equations to actually write down what you mean by this second kind of learning, belief updating, and the very structure and the model of in itself. So that was that one. Graphical brain. Yeah, I just put that up to. We've done that one. I just put that up to just to high. If you don't know what I mean by you can't use predictive coding and the notion of precision-weighted prediction errors in the context of discrete state-space models, it may be worthwhile just reading this treatment of hybrid models that have predictive coding and precision-weighted prediction errors at the bottom. But as soon as you start to get to levels of abstraction of the kind you're talking about that have semantics, then you move to belief propagation and variational message passing. But it's perfectly possible to have both. And the maths is very, very similar. It's just that you can't, there's no explicit representation of prediction errors anymore. They're still there implicitly, but they actually have a much simpler form, which inherits from the KL divergence. So this paper, The Graphical Brain, just tries to explain the commonalities between the predictive coding formulation under continuous state-space models and the message passing under discrete state space models, and then relate that to the biological processes. Again, I don't think it's terribly important from your point of view, because you can keep everything at the level of KL divergences. You don't need to worry about the neurobiological implementation. But if you're interested, this is where the distinction is sort of formally unpacked for you to show the differences and the similarities between the two. So I don't know if that was that helpful. Was that the kind of feedback you were? Oh, no, I can stop sharing from here. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Yeah. No. Absolutely. I mean, I think. Yeah, I thought that I made some errors. I guess I didn't realize as many as I did. So this is super helpful. And I'm going to obviously unpack kind of the papers you suggested and the feedback that. But yeah, I mean, turning this into structured learning, focusing, I guess, specifically on the structured learning and knowing. Sorry, that representing that as the KL divergences and putting the kind of references to the the higher levels within that. Yeah, that's what I took from it, and I know I'm going to kind of get it deeper and particularly the plan too with okay, then doing a write up, and I have been in touch with other folks from active inference, so this is what the simulation would look like, and hopefully finding some folks. Maybe we'll reach out to Ryan and others who might be kind of interested in helping me flesh it out. But yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a delicate question as how you're going to spend your time and how you're going to have most impact. I mean, one trick would be just to lift graphics from the literature that have already been produced by simulators of active inference by people who love the computational neurobiology, but just relabel it. Say, look, this was done for learning emotional concepts. Yeah. But imagine had we just relabeled that in terms of personality types, or into so you actually take sort of literally the figures from that have been published and use them. So you don't actually have to do all the heavy lifting of learning by MDP. And I repeat, to do what you want to do, which is, it's the next level. You not only have you got sort of structural learning now as the next level, you've also now got in the context of multi-agent simulations. It's really, you're in that sort of, almost unexplored territory. And I just worry that if you spend too much time learning how to code all this up, by the time you've done that, you'll either be tired out or someone else would have written down the ideas as a hypothesis piece. So it's I'd just go for it and write it all down in narrative form.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think I have to think about this for a little bit, and then yeah, I like that as a way forward. This is great. Oh.
Fantastic. Just another round of applause for the presentation. I believe that's a wrap then. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Thank you very much, Shagor, for your brilliant presentation. Thank you, Carl, for the extensive discussion. And yeah, I look forward to seeing everyone at another TNB meeting. And I remain wishing everyone a lovely afternoon. See you soon.
Thank you. Happy Christmas.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.